Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. As nonprofit leadership is increasingly under the microscope when it comes to public trust, transparency, and accountability, particularly in light of recent high-profile revelations about organizations such as Hockey Canada and We Charity, and as the sector grapples with the lack of diversity at the leadership level, we ask, is it time for a leadership refresh? Joining me to discuss these important issues is Paulette Senior, CEO and President of the Canadian Women's Foundation. In 2016, Paulette joined the Canadian Women's Foundation after a decade serving as CEO of YWCA Canada. She's a sought-after thought leader on numerous issues, including gender equity and gender-based violence, women's poverty and the wage gap, girls' empowerment, and leadership. Paulette, welcome to CharityVillage Connects.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me today.
Well, the Ontario Nonprofit Network calls the nonprofit sector women majority, but not women-led. There are even fewer diverse women in leadership positions, not to mention trans, two-spirit, and non-binary persons. Can you talk about the lack of women at the leadership level in the sector, as well as how the lack of diversity impacts nonprofit organizations and the communities they serve?
Sure, and I'm so glad that you've made the distinction between women dominant and women led, because that really is the true story of the nonprofit sector as it is today. And the nonprofit sector is one that has a very long history in Canada. It's a story that's been told based on previous articles that's been written by experts in the sector. And I think it's important because we need to understand, the history is important because we need to understand it for an understanding of, let's say, contemporary issues as they exist today. And the legacy speaks to the history or the historical charitable sector trends and themes. So we know that they've been historically largely faith-based, and many still are, that they're intertwined charity projects connected to colonial domination and wealth. That is the history. It's not something that's deniable. And also, there's been a tidal shift away from advocacy towards modern day provision of public services in lieu of government services. So that's really where things have shifted over the years. And what this gives us is a good grounding on the reality of the highest levels of the nonprofit leadership as historically been white, male-led, monocultural, and straight, and other kinds of those characteristics. Women today, we know, dominate the nonprofit labor force in terms of the specific raw numbers that we see. But the nonprofit organization labor force is underpaid, and we know this from the statistics that we've seen. So it's underpaid, and women earn less than men at all management levels within the sector, and women's representation drops as seniority levels rise. So that is the trend that we have now. The 2019 Canadian nonprofit sector salary and benefit study shows that women make up 85% of nonprofit support staff, but hold 70% of senior executive positions. So where women are in leadership positions, they're often primarily white women. There are significant gaps in terms of board and executive leadership, especially for racialized and Black and Indigenous women and other folks such as women with disabilities or 2S LGBTQIA folks. And in gender justice nonprofit organizations, our closest partners at the foundation that we work with, there is a more what I would call sort of robust leadership diversity across gender, race, and identity lines. And we also see that there's a high commitment to intersectional feminist approaches. So a real sort of powerful building block for inclusion exists within the sector that we work in. But there are gaps that we still have to close here too, such as leadership gaps for Black and racialized women and women with disabilities, for example. So that's really what we're seeing in terms of the history, but also where we've come since then.
Well, multiple reports, including from Environics and in the CanTrust Index by Proof Strategies, have indicated there's been a sharp decline in public trust of charities over the past decade. What factors do you see as influencing this drop in trust? Do you think it's the fact that in many cases the sector doesn't reflect the society, the communities that they serve because of this lack of diversity at certainly in the leadership level?
Well, I think that's certainly part of it. I've been in the sector my entire life. I've worked in the nonprofit and charitable sector, so I've certainly seen some changes along the way. When I first started in the sector back in the late 80s, it was really a sector that I loved and cherished and relished in. It was inspiring to be doing the work that my heart desired. But I also saw that for the most part, the leadership did not reflect me. It didn't reflect the people we're serving. And really, it was really, I would say, an approach to working within a charitable model, sort of an old school model that didn't really look at the reflection of those who were being served, and saw the need to make sure that those who were being served were also the ones who were doing the serving, so to speak, and not just at the frontline level, but also at the leadership level. So clearly, there are ways that or strategies that we need to put in place to address the leadership in the sector, to ensure that there are more effective pathways for women to be able to lead. And there are a number of strategies that I've seen that are important in terms of creating the kind of structural changes that need to happen to diversify, including making sort of strategic commitments and investment in leadership transformation. There are many initiatives out there that have come over the years. Currently, there's the 50-30 challenge with the kind of bench strength of budget allocations and accountability reporting measures, because we know that if it's not being measured, it's not being done because there's no accountability attached to it. And then there's also the kind of recruiting executives and board members who themselves, I think, need to carry equity building skill sets and track records to do a great job in terms of diversifying representation across the organization, including at the board nomination level in committees. And I would also add that trying executive and board performance measures to make sure that the success is being measured. So it's something, for example, that we have included in our strategic plan as an organization when we look at the gaps that we have. And this is something I see is needed across the sector. And asking and responding to what diverse people in other parts of the organization need for retention, especially now where retention is a significant issue because of the large gaps that we're seeing across multi-sectors. It's no different for our sector. And making sure that it's not just about retaining people where they're at, but providing opportunities for them to move into leadership levels, whatever strategies that could be mentorship or sponsorship programs, compensation to make sure that it's, folks are earning livable and healthy wages, as well as the flexibility that folks require because of their caregiving responsibilities, and making sure that our environments are fostering a sense of safety to reduce possible discriminatory practices or sexual and gender-based harassment that exists in the workplace. And because if we don't do this, then we're actually contributing to creating pipelines that are not working, and in fact become leaky talent pipelines. And we know that this is preventable in terms of what we need to do.
Well, moving to the subject of philanthropy, you recently published a call for philanthropy to do more to support the needs of women and girls, suggesting that they receive less than 2% of charitable giving. This is the kind of chronic underfunding that we've seen with Indigenous and Black-led organizations as well. Can you discuss the role philanthropy has to play in supporting gender equity in Canada?
I love this question because it actually gets to where we're at as a foundation. We've been around for just over 30 years, so we're still fairly young in the foundation world. And we were really created to respond to this particular issue around 2% of charitable giving going specifically towards women and girls. And so when the founders created the foundation, it was really about making sure that we can provide a channel through which we can increase that particular level of giving to the work that we're doing. And so we saw the need to address this in a specific way around the role that philanthropy has to play. Specifically, we created what we call the feminist philanthropy approach to being able to address the way that women and girls programs are funded, which amongst other things is really a huge in terms of addressing inequities in funding and actively tries to address them. So it's not just recognizing that the gap exists, but it's an active way of really trying to narrow that gap and to address the inequities specifically. And this kind of feminist philanthropic approach recognizes a number of things. It recognizes that there's still an impact in terms of colonialism. It recognizes that historically, the nonprofit sector has been one that has been impacted. In fact, as into everything, been impacted by the legacy of patriarchy in terms of charity and the charitable model of helping the poor, so to speak. And how philanthropy has worked, and it funds differently. It funds from a place of meeting people where they're at. It funds differently by trusting the organizations that we work with, but with the understanding that feminist philanthropy is an important way of recognizing inequities and funding to address those inequities by not just who we fund, but what is the work that we're funding.
I'm curious whether you think that there are systemic barriers that exist when it comes to a more equitable distribution of philanthropic funds. Do you feel that the legislative changes, such as the disbursement quotas, are steps forward in this regard?
Well, I think it's a beginning, and it's no surprise that I would think that there are definitely systemic barriers that exist. A 30-year analysis of giving patterns finds that more than 60% of these charitable dollars go to health and hospitals, which, is always in need of funds, not just for the running of the hospital, but also for research. We also know it also goes to religious causes as well as international work. Most of those dollars, though, are likely not earmarked for domestic gender equality matters. And there's some reasons for that. There are myths around prosperity. So, for example, Canada, as we know, is a well-resourced country, but of course, not everyone experiences that kind of abundance that the myth sort of propagates. And gender pay gaps, especially those faced by racialized women, women with disabilities, and newcomers, illustrate this very clearly. And part of the myth around gender pay gaps is that it doesn't exist. Well, we know it does, and we also know it's stratified. And that we know, for example, when it comes to Indigenous women or Black and racialized women, that gap is significantly wider. And even now, women's wages are not rising to match mounting inflation that we're living in at the moment, which worsens their high levels of poverty. They're also not just myths, but also illusions of relative safety. So gender-based violence is still prevalent in Canada. Already it is too high as a baseline, and we have seen it spiked during the pandemic. We wrote about this significantly in terms of some of the papers that we produced and the responses that we had during the pandemic. And pervasive violence against women, girls, and gender diverse people, they continue to be an under-recognized state of emergency in Canada and around the world. So it's this kind of silent pandemic that continues to happen under the radar. But when you work in the sector, we actually see the results based on the folks that we're serving in communities across the country. Another part of that is that men hold more giving wealth in Canada as individuals, and given corporate leadership diversity gaps that we know exist, men likely hold more philanthropic decision-making power there as well. And giving often reflects the values of the person who's giving, right? So, someone who gives is really giving according to their values and lived experiences. And finally, cultural expectations is part of this. So women are saddled with expectations of selfless giving. It's almost part of our DNA. The emotional and material weight of family and community support and unpaid and underpaid labor is a part of the cultural expectations. So really, we expect women's lives to be difficult and draining. And women's suffering does not shock or move us anymore because it's part of cultural expectations, especially when we're talking about single moms or racialized folks living with a disability or living in poverty. These are just part of the cultural expectations, so it's not a surprise. And so the disbursement quota changes that we see can be helpful. It's a beginning. But doing that alone will likely not rectify even sort of the disproportionate giving to under-supported causes and communities. And so we need other solutions that will also help include building gender measures into corporate giving and ESG programs that we know are important for the corporate sector, and workplace government giving policies that actively reward giving to under-supported causes and groups.
Do you mind if I ask you whether you think that Bill S-216, which was passed as Bill C-19 in the Budget Implementation Act around being able to give to non-qualified donees, do you think that will help to free up more funds to go to, more community-based groups or frontline groups that are not qualified donees? Yes. Do you think it'll help?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up because I think it's related to the increase in the disbursement quota as well. And I was a member of the first iteration of the advisory committee on the charitable sector, and I had the honor of chairing the sub committee that was looking at the needs for sort of grassroots communities and what we need to do around more equitable giving. And so this was one of the recommendations, Mary, that we put forward to look at the inequities that existed, because we know the groups that are have not chosen or cannot, because they don't have the capacity to have a charitable number, are really responses to what are groups that come up because of responses they're seeing or issues that they're seeing to I would say long-lived, deeply systemic issues in their communities, and they're mostly grassroots. And so the structure that exists, that still exists, where we could only fund organizations that have charitable status, really left many organizations out of the picture and out of being able to access critical resources to address those issues. And as someone who works in mainstream organizations, despite the fact that I'm a Black woman leading that, there's a lot to be said around what mainstream organizations miss when it comes to specific communities, well, whether it's LGBTQIA communities or whether it's, South Asian communities, even folks within disability communities. So I welcome change that will create greater access, access for non-charitable organizations to apply to us for funds, but also for us to be able to, as a funder, reach out to some of those organizations to say, we'd love to work with you to do that without this sort of direction and control requirement that's been in place for so long. So I've seen the first set of guidelines that's been drafted by the folks at Revenue Canada, and I know that there's been a response to what some of those changes need to be. I really hope that at the end of the day, it will make a significant difference and impact to make sure that we're not putting up more barriers, but that we're actually destroying those barriers and putting in place what works with accountability, of course. It doesn't mean that there's no accountability. It just means that there's greater access and making sure that whatever we put in place can actually provide that.
Well, when it comes to issuing grants, does the Canadian Women's Foundation have any best practices to share or innovative approaches? You've talked about some of your approaches to philanthropy generally, but with regards to dealing with applications and reporting, or in terms of trust-based philanthropy, do you have any sort of advice for other organizations that they may want to consider to be more equitable in terms of the distribution of their funds?
Mm-hmm. Well, another great question, Mary, and maybe I can just share a couple points with respect to examples that we've had, and also, how we've managed to address a gap that we see, specifically when you look at rural and remote communities. So, with that example, we're really strong in being able to fund organizations within urban centers. That has not been a challenge for us. We're certainly oversubscribed in terms of applications from urban centers, but it wasn't the case when it came to communities across the north, the territory specifically, but also communities that were in rural and remote communities. And so we've actually paid specific attention to accessing resources that we can then fund organizations in more rural and urban, as well as northern communities. And so that's really been very helpful for us, because what we realize is that the application process that we had in place was itself a barrier to those organizations applying for the funds. And so we took stock of what it is that was getting in the way when we can't even get one or two great applications from the north, for example. And so we created a different way of going about that work, because we are national in scope. But if we are not able to reach rural and remote communities, then we're failing in that endeavor. And so we partnered with an organization across the north where, for example, who is based in Iqaluit and Nunavut. And then we hired staff from the community who could then sort of work with community directly and specifically to identify initiatives, community initiatives that were needed within that community, and sort of build a capacity to solicit funding for those initiatives. So, for example, a good example of that success has been the creation of a doula program, establishing a doula program in the north, so that women who are expecting didn't always have to come south in order to get the support they needed during their pregnancy. And then also, in more sort of remote communities, making sure, or rural communities, making sure that we were adopting different approaches to being able to, which could be collaborations or just finding more innovative ways of reaching out to communities, so that we didn't always continue to only fund urban centers. So that's a really good example of the kind of approach that we're taking. It includes also grounding our giving priorities in sort of, what are the stated needs of grantee partners. And we've had long-standing grantee partners over the years, and making sure that we work alongside them in terms of the evaluation and impact pieces. It also includes being ready to pivot as needed in unexpected crises, So that could be fires or floods or a pandemic. And so we were able, for example, to quickly shift our funding of gendered impacts as it related to the pandemic. And then also, we have taken to funding advocacy and systemic policy work as programs because responding to the needs of communities is important, and that work must continue and be well funded. But we also are interested in supporting those who are what we call movement builders and shift makers, who we know are underfunded and, in fact, probably is a shrinking group in Canada, to make sure that they can continue to advocate for the systemic changes that they're seeing in the community, not just on a local level, but nationally as well. And then working with grantee partners to make reporting mutually beneficial and manageable, to make sure that the reporting that we're requiring actually makes sense and is bona fide.
Well, those are some terrific examples and really showed innovation in how you were approaching the way that you were addressing getting the kind of funds that you wanted to the right people, and taking that initiative to be able to really, I guess, examine how you were doing it in order to find innovative ways to diversify.
And being honest, Mary, being honest about what we weren't doing well, and including strategies to address that in our strategic plan, so that we were serious about it and we could measure the impact of it.
Yeah, that's very commendable. And so I just wanted to wrap up by asking you that as a leader of a national grant giving foundation, do you think that philanthropy as we currently think of it really needs to be reimagined? Certainly, you've given us some examples of how you've reimagined the work that you do. What would a new approach to philanthropy look like to you?
Well, for us, we call that reimagining sort of feminist philanthropy, which I mentioned earlier. And it really is about, philanthropists giving to undo sort of long-standing relationships to address social structures that have seemed immovable for so long, and really aim to raise the power and ambition of all women, girls, trans, and non-binary people, so that we're not leaving anyone out in terms of the work. And to be able to support the pursuit of truth and reconciliation and decolonizing practices, and figuring out what that looks like for us as a foundation within our scope of work. It also includes supporting and building collective action and movement, so working with others collaboratively, taking direction from organizations that are led by people they represent, and acting on the concept of nothing about us without us, a popular concept, but it's quite meaningful to those organizations. And being not afraid to be challenged. Sometimes challenging can get our backs up as organizations when we think we're doing great work. But it's also being open to being challenged so that we could do better. I think that's also a part of it, to make sure that we continue to be a learning organization. And we're really seeing growth in young, wealthy donors. So we're seeing that significantly right now. It's part of the growing sort of groups of philanthropists that we're seeing in North America as well. And we're also seeing that they want to do differently. So they're recognizing that there are things they want to address. They're recognizing that they want to give in a different way and not just a traditional way. And I think that what this requires is that they must insist on what we call systemic change beyond traditional charity, not just in their giving, but in the power of their voices as they support democratic civic engagement and movement building. We're seeing a lot of this research primarily in the US, but I think it speaks to what we think will also happen significantly here in Canada. So it's really about kind of making sure that there's growth in wealth, that recognizing the growth in wealth inequalities or inequities that exist, the very proliferation of millionaires and billionaires that we're seeing alongside deepening poverty. We're seeing these two things at the same times. And it means that our social systems and safety nets could be breaking down. So it's an irony that we're living in terms of the times that we're in, where young wealth holders who want real change must themselves advocate against over concentrated wealth and oversized economic and social power that exists for the few. So, this is a challenge for sure. And we know that younger generations are really seeing things in a different way, through a different lens, whether you're talking the corporate sector or even in our own sector. We're seeing young folks are demanding change, and that the traditional ways are outlived, so to speak.
Yeah, that's so interesting how young donors generally really look to that sort of, where is the immediate impact of what I'm doing? Not larger foundations and donors, but even young people who are donating to their, crowdfunding favorite charities or nonprofit efforts look to that sort of impact that they can feel that they've made a difference. So that's really fascinating. It's been quite enlightening speaking with you, Paulette, about the nonprofit sector and charitable foundations, as well as leadership. Your expertise and insight on so many issues are so valuable to hear. I'm delighted to have been able to speak to you on CharityVillage Connects. So thank you for joining us on our podcast.